What if the interview the world saw was never the real interview at all? What if the calm, polished Meghan Markle sitting across from Harper's Bazaar wasn't giving an honest conversation, but performing a carefully constructed illusion, one so delicate, so obsessively controlled, that even the editor-in-chief herself walked away whispering that something was wrong? That's where our story begins today, with a question most people didn't dare to ask. Why would a woman who claims to be embracing authenticity orchestrate an entrance so dramatic it bordered on self-parody? An entrance announced like royalty into a room containing exactly one person. And more importantly, what was she trying to hide? Because the truth is, interviews don't usually come with rehearsed introductions, rewritten questions, and demands so odd they made seasoned editors exchange confused glances. Interviews don't usually require that staff members not make eye contact, unless spoken to first. Interviews don't typically involve an emotional unraveling so unexpected. The highest-ranking editor present later described the entire process as staged. But this one did, and that's why it matters. That's why this interview, this glossy, beautifully framed, deceptively serene conversation, has become the center of a storm Meghan never intended to unleash. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being Samira Nasser for a moment, editor-in-chief, veteran of the fashion media world, a woman who has interviewed celebrities across the entire spectrum of fame, a woman who has seen egos, insecurity, charm, talent, chaos, sometimes all in the same hour. And yet, when she stepped into that room and watched Meghan Markle prepare for what was supposed to be a simple conversation, something inside her shifted. Because Meghan wasn't preparing to talk. She was preparing to perform. Every gesture rehearsed. Every sentence mentally pre-polished. Every emotion strategically placed. It was as if she weren't meeting a journalist, but staging an audition. One meant to convince the world she was still the woman she wanted everyone to believe she was. Brave, misunderstood, visionary, unstoppable. But why would someone supposedly comfortable in her truth need to engineer such an atmosphere of spectacle? Why would a woman supposedly redefining independence demand the type of entrance typically reserved for royalty or dictators? Why would anyone need that level of control unless something behind the curtain was dangerously unstable? And here's where things take an even stranger turn. Samira didn't just sense the artificiality. She saw it. She wrote it down. And eventually, she leaked it. Not because she wanted to cause trouble, but because she couldn't carry the weight of what she had witnessed. She couldn't lie to herself or the industry any longer. So let's look closer at this bizarre moment that kicked off everything. Meghan Markle, standing behind a door, refusing to enter until someone announced her presence. Not greeted, not welcomed, not acknowledged. Announced. An official declaration of her arrival for an audience consisting of exactly one woman holding a recorder. You have to ask yourself, who was the performance really for? The interviewer? The imaginary cameras? Or Meghan herself? Why create the illusion of royalty in a room where reality has no place to hide? This moment alone reveals more about where Meghan's mindset is right now than any polished soundbite ever could. Because someone confident, calm, and grounded doesn't need theatrics to feel important. Someone secure in their narrative doesn't need to demand validation from a rehearsed entrance. Someone in control of their image doesn't fear the camera. And yet here she was, demanding precision, choreography, and reverence. And Samira saw it, felt it, and immediately realized this wasn't an interview anymore. It was a production, a fragile one. One in which the star was trying desperately to convince everyone, maybe even herself, that she hadn't lost control. Because in Hollywood, in media, in royalty, the moment you lose the narrative, you lose everything. And Meghan knows that better than anyone. But what she didn't know was that this interview would expose her, not protect her. But a performance can only hold for so long before something cracks. And crack it did. Because everything in this interview, every line, every pose, every pause, was carefully calculated until Samira asked one question that should have been harmless. A question about Meghan's jam. Yes, jam. A conversation that should have been lighthearted quickly turned into something far more revealing. Meghan's entire persona wobbled. The softness disappeared. The tension rose. Her need for control spiked. and the mask slipped just enough for Samira to see the truth. Meghan wasn't here to talk about jam. She was here to rebrand, reinvent, reassert power. So when she was asked to explain her sudden fascination with homemaking, with branding herself as a brave woman making jam in a California kitchen, she unraveled. Because even she didn't believe it. And when she heard a whisper, the whisper she was never meant to hear, the whisper that someone in the room quietly muttered about her acting, everything stopped. The room went silent. Meghan's eyes changed. And the fragile performance came crashing down harder than anyone expected. And here's where the story transforms from uncomfortable to shocking. Meghan didn't just push back. She snapped. The temperature shifted. The energy tightened. And Samira suddenly found herself managing not a conversation, but a crisis. A meltdown. A desperate attempt from Meghan to regain control of a narrative that had begun slipping through her fingers like sand. And what happened after that whisper? What Meghan demanded next? What she accused the staff of? What she confessed to, accidentally, because her emotions overpowered her rehearsed lines. That's the moment that forced Samira to take notes. That's the moment that convinced her she needed to say something. That's the moment she realized the world would never understand the truth unless she told it. Because the meltdown that followed wasn't the kind you expect from a seasoned actress or a polished duchess. It was personal, raw, unfiltered, and it exposed a desperation Meghan didn't intend anyone, least of all a journalist, to see. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The meltdown wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Why would a woman who has been in front of cameras her entire adult life suddenly behave like someone terrified of being seen? That's the question that hangs in the air as we step directly into Chapter 1, because everything that followed in that room only makes sense if you understand one thing first. This interview was never designed to be normal. It wasn't casual. It wasn't relaxed. It wasn't exploratory. It was a stage play with one actress, one script, and one mission: control the narrative at all costs. So when Meghan Markle stepped into that Harper's Bazaar setting, she wasn't stepping into a conversation. She was stepping into a performance she had crafted in her head long before Samira Nasser arrived. And if you've ever watched someone try to control something slipping out of their hands, you already know, the stronger the grip, the more dramatic the fallout. Imagine entering what should be a straightforward interview environment. Just a small studio space, warm lighting, a single camera, a beverage table, and a few staff members quietly setting up. It should feel calm. It should feel professional. But instead, the energy is dense. Everything feels strangely rehearsed, as if the room has been reset 3 times before your arrival. The staff aren't chatting. They're silent. They move quickly, but carefully, like they're afraid of knocking over an invisible tower of glass. And then you hear it. That announcement. A voice, too loud, too ceremonial, declaring Meghan Markle's entrance the way someone might announce the Queen of England. Except the Queen would never demand it. And Meghan? She insisted on it. That's where the absurdity becomes impossible to ignore. Who was the announcement for? There's no crowd, no press line, no sea of photographers, no royal procession. There is only Samira, a recorder, and a couple of staff members. Which means that moment wasn't about grandeur. It wasn't about respect. It wasn't about protocol. It was about power, and the need to reinforce it. So let's ask the real question. What kind of mindset requires a grand entrance for an audience of one? What kind of internal pressure pushes a person to create a spectacle where none is needed? This wasn't confidence. It was insecurity dressed as royalty. It was self-doubt disguised as grandeur. And Samira felt it immediately. She later described that instant as the moment she realized the interview would not be about authenticity. It would be about control. And think about that. An editor-in-chief, someone used to handling egos the size of skyscrapers, sensed something unusually off in the first 10 seconds. That says everything. Meghan didn't walk in with the relaxed presence of a woman ready to express herself. She walked in with the tightly wound energy of someone terrified of appearing anything less than perfect. But perfection is fragile, and fragile things crack under pressure. As Meghan entered, she didn't smile. She didn't greet the staff warmly. She didn't look around the room with curiosity or comfort. She behaved like an actress walking onto a movie set, eyes scanning, posture stiff, every movement deliberate, as if the walls themselves were judging her. as if one misplaced gesture might disrupt the illusion she needed Samira to believe. And here's where the contradictions start to reveal themselves. Meghan speaks endlessly about authenticity, vulnerability, emotional truth. Yet nothing about her demeanor felt spontaneous or genuine. Her face was composed, not naturally composed, but strategically composed. Her voice modulated, not warm, but calculated. Her body language tight, not active, but defensive. And if you've ever watched a person trying to hold together a persona they don't fully believe in anymore, you'll recognize the signs immediately. Meghan wasn't performing confidence. She was performing survival. Samira, standing there with her notes and her producer instincts buzzing, understood she was witnessing something deeper than diva behavior. She was witnessing a woman caught between the image she wanted to present and the reality she couldn't escape. And that's when she noticed something else: the staff's eyes, their silence, their tenseness, their need to avoid eye contact. This wasn't admiration. This wasn't respect. It was fear, not the dramatic, movie-ready kind of fear, but the exhausted, here we go again kind. The kind you see in people who have been dealing with unreasonable demands for hours before the main event even begins. And Meghan noticed their tension too. You could see it in the way her eyes flickered around the room, gauging reactions, checking posture, monitoring body language. She wasn't just conscious of her image. She was hyperconscious. And that level of self-monitoring always leads somewhere messy. Then came the first demand of the day. A small one, at first, but revealing. Meghan asked for the lighting to be shifted 3 degrees to the left because she didn't want shadows under her eyes. 3 degrees. Not an inch. Not a foot. 3 degrees. You might think that's precision. You might think it's a professional understanding of angles. But to Samira, it was something else entirely. It was a warning sign. Because when someone starts by controlling angles, they usually move on to controlling people. And Meghan did exactly that. She asked for the interviewer's chair to be lowered so she would appear slightly higher in frame. Then she asked that the water bottle be replaced because she didn't like how the brand logo looked next to her outfit. Then she asked that the air conditioning be adjusted because the temperature was not optimal for speaking. One demand after another. Small things. Trivial things. But the pattern was clear. Meghan couldn't let anything happen organically. Everything had to be shaped, molded, and perfected before she could even begin. But you have to ask yourself, why? Why would someone who constantly talks about being free from constraints behave like someone trapped inside them? Why would a woman who claims to have left the monarchy behind recreate the same rituals, the same formality, the same expectation of deference? This wasn't liberation. It was repetition, a self-inflicted echo of a world she walked away from, yet couldn't resist rebuilding around herself. Something about that truth hit Samira with a force she didn't expect. And even though she stayed polite, professional, poised, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building in her chest. Something was wrong. Something was off. And that realization would later lead her to leak the most unexpected details the public has heard about Meghan in years. Then, and this is where everything shifts, Meghan stopped speaking for the cameras and started whispering instructions to her team. Not gentle whispers. Sharp ones. Urgent ones. The kind that make everyone around her stand straighter, move faster, breathe quieter. She kept adjusting her posture, checking her reflection in passing surfaces, practicing micro-expressions in the glossy black of the equipment cases. She practiced smiling, practiced tilting her head, practiced widening her eyes at just the right emotional moment. And Samira watched all of this in stunned silence. Because this wasn't an actress preparing for a scene. It was a woman preparing to manipulate perception itself, preparing to shape how the world would see her for the next news cycle, preparing to craft a new version of herself to replace an old one that no longer worked. But the real tension didn't emerge until Samira asked herself the question no one in the room dared say out loud. If Meghan felt the need to control every detail, every angle, every word, every movement, what would happen when something didn't go according to plan? What would happen when reality broke through the script? What would happen when the performance collided with something she couldn't choreograph? Because that moment was coming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't just disrupt the interview. It would shatter it. But the moment that triggered everything, the spark that lit the fuse, was still ahead. And no one in that room, not even Samira, saw it coming. Why did Samira Nasser feel a knot tighten in her stomach the moment Meghan finally settled into her chair? Why did a seasoned editor-in-chief, someone who had interviewed the most unpredictable, volatile, dramatic personalities in entertainment and fashion, suddenly sense that she was stepping into something different, something heavier, something strangely manufactured? That's the question that opens Chapter 2, because the moment each person in that room exhaled after Meghan's dramatic entrance, the energy did not settle. It didn't soften. It sharpened, and Samira felt it first. The interview hadn't even started, yet the performance already had. Meghan sat with the posture of a woman auditioning for the role of Meghan Markle, carefully choosing which version of herself she planned to play today. There was the Hollywood version, polished, warm, camera-ready. The humanitarian version, softly spoken, gentle, controlled. The Duchess version, dignified, slightly aloof, subtly superior. And then there was the version Samira was now seeing, tense, restless, scanning the room like someone expecting betrayal at any moment. And if you've ever watched someone carefully build a persona brick by brick, you know the truth. People only do that when the real version underneath is cracking. People only cling to performance when authenticity feels dangerous. Samira lifted her pen, pretending to jot down a few warm-up notes. But really, she was observing. She noticed how Meghan's eyes darted between her and the staff, silently evaluating everyone's posture, their expressions, their exact level of attentiveness. Meghan wasn't just gauging the room. She was assessing loyalty. She wasn't just preparing for an interview. She was monitoring a narrative. But the most telling detail, one Samira would later write privately in her notes, was that Meghan seemed more worried about being perceived than being heard. There is a difference. A big one. One reveals insecurity. The other reveals fear. Maybe that's why Samira's first impression wasn't starstruck admiration. It was concern. Because something in the air felt off, like everyone was walking on a floor covered in glass shards, afraid to take a wrong step. Even the small sounds, the shuffle of a chair, the click of a pen, felt amplified. And Meghan noticed everything. She would sharply turn her head toward the smallest noise. Her eyes tightened whenever a staff member moved too quickly. She flinched when someone whispered. It was hyper-awareness bordering on paranoia. And Samira, trained to read people as much as she reads words, knew she was dealing with a woman operating under an enormous amount of internal pressure. But here's where it truly gets interesting. The moment Meghan opened her mouth, her tone changed. Completely. In an instant, she switched from tense and watchful to soft and serene, like flipping a switch. Her smile appeared, too fast to be natural, too practiced to be spontaneous. Her voice dropped into that familiar, performative warmth she uses in interviews. She praised the team, thanked Samira for being there, made a few self-deprecating jokes. And for a moment, the room almost believed her. But Samira didn't, because the transition was too seamless, too choreographed, too much like someone trying to convince the audience, and themselves, that everything was fine. This contradiction, this emotional split screen, is what first set off Samira's internal alarm. Because confident people don't flip personalities like that. Relaxed people don't. Honest people don't. People who feel safe don't. But people who feel watched, judged, threatened, they do. People who are terrified of losing control, they do. And people who are performing for survival, they definitely do. So if Meghan was performing for survival, what was she surviving? Samira tried to ease the tension with light questions, gentle conversation starters, and compliments about Meghan's recent projects. But even those small comments seemed to hit Meghan strangely. She smiled, but her eyes carried a flicker of suspicion, like she was searching each statement for hidden meaning. It was as if she were waiting, anticipating the slightest hint of criticism. And that's when Samira realized Meghan wasn't just worried about how she would sound in the final article. She was terrified of how she would look during the process of giving it. Every gesture mattered. Every angle mattered. Every breath mattered. Because in Meghan's mind, everything was evidence. Everything was ammunition. Everything could be turned against her. Then came the moment Samira would later refer to as the first true red flag. A staff member, trying to be helpful, adjusted the recorder stand by just an inch. A completely normal gesture. A small adjustment. But Meghan's reaction was instant. She stiffened. Her jaw tightened. She stopped mid-sentence. She asked sharply, "Why are you moving it?" Not rude, not explosive, but sharp enough to make the staff member freeze in place. Sharp enough to freeze the entire room. Sharp enough to make Samira realize that something beneath the surface was brewing. And it wasn't creativity. It was fear. And here's the contradiction that hit Samira hardest. Meghan talked endlessly about being calm, grateful, aligned, and centered. Yet everything about her energy screamed the opposite. She preached authenticity, yet she was micromanaging every inch of the room. She branded herself as empowered, yet she acted like someone one wrong gesture away from unraveling. She presented herself as independent, yet she required a level of control that bordered on suffocation. These contradictions weren't small. They weren't subtle. They were screaming, and Samira heard every one of them. So when the actual interview questions finally began, Samira expected Meghan to loosen up. She expected the usual warm banter celebrities slip into once they hit their talking points. But Meghan didn't loosen. She tightened. Every question felt like it had to pass through an internal filter before she answered. She paused too long, smiled too wide, choreographed her gestures with unnatural precision. She touched her hair at the exact same moments. She angled her chin exactly 10 degrees before every emotional sentence. If you were watching closely, it was impossible not to notice she wasn't speaking. She was performing. That's when Samira had her second major realization. Meghan wasn't afraid of the interview. She was afraid of the narrative slipping away. Because a woman who feels in control doesn't behave like this. A woman who feels secure doesn't rehearse micro-expressions. A woman who believes her own story doesn't need to manufacture it so aggressively. And that's when Samira wrote a single line in her notebook, one that she never planned to share, but eventually did. Something feels staged. Not something is wrong. Not she's tense. Not she's difficult. Samira was too professional, too experienced, too tactful for that. Instead, she chose the one word that captured the feeling no one else dared acknowledge: staged. Not authentic. Not natural, not human, staged. And that one word would later unravel everything. But Samira's unease wasn't just internal anymore. It began to show in the way she asked questions, in the way she watched Meghan's eyes, in the way she noticed the staff tiptoeing around the room, in the way she observed every little moment that didn't match the polished public persona. Because Meghan could control the lighting. She could control the angles. She could control the narrative she wanted to present. But she couldn't control her own energy, and energy never lies. So when Meghan answered a soft question about reinvention with a long, overly theatrical pause, eyes lifted, chin angled, voice trembling slightly, like she had practiced vulnerability, Samira saw it clearly. It wasn't real. It was rehearsed. And that realization shifted everything. It transformed the interview from a conversation into an examination. A slow, careful peeling back of a persona trying desperately not to crack in front of a woman who had spent her entire career detecting cracks. But the moment that confirmed everything, the moment that took Samira's quiet suspicions and turned them into certainty, was only seconds away. Because the first true demand, the one that froze the room and exposed the truth Samira had only guessed at, was about to hit like a shockwave. And absolutely no one was ready for it. What kind of person looks around a quiet interview room, a room with soft lighting, 2 chairs, and a calm editorial team, and suddenly decides that nothing happening inside it is acceptable unless every single detail bends to their will? That's where Chapter 3 begins, because the next demand Meghan made wasn't dramatic, explosive, or loud. It was quiet, controlled, precise, and somehow, that made it even more unsettling. This wasn't diva rage. It was diva calculation, the kind that sends a chill down the spine because you realize you're not dealing with an impulsive personality. You're dealing with someone meticulously constructing a world where she cannot be contradicted, challenged, or even perceived in a way she hasn't pre-approved. And Samira Nasser, sitting across from her, watching everything unfold, felt a sudden shift in the air. Because this next request didn't just show insecurity. It showed obsession. It started small, almost innocently. Meghan leaned forward and asked a staff member to adjust the distance of the recording microphone by exactly 2 inches. 2. Not 1, not 3. 2. But the real problem wasn't the request. It was her tone. A soft, tight voice that made the staff member freeze mid-step, as if Meghan had just issued a royal command rather than a preference. And when the microphone wasn't moved to her satisfaction the first time, she asked again. This time with a slight narrowing of her eyes that told everyone, there will be no mistakes today. Because mistakes lead to imperfection, and imperfection leads to loss of control. And loss of control? Meghan would rather combust. Samira watched closely. The shift in Meghan's demeanor was unmistakable. Her shoulders stiffened. Her breathing changed, small, shallow, controlled sips of air. She clasped her hands together a little too tightly. Her smile remained, but it was hard around the edges, the kind of smile that hurts to hold. And as she monitored every inch of the room, Samira realized something alarming. Meghan wasn't preparing for an interview. She was preparing for an attack. As if one wrong camera angle, one poorly placed shadow, one unflattering frame could be used against her in some imaginary tribunal judging her existence. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of pressure does a person have to be under to view a simple Harper's Bazaar conversation as a battlefield? Then came the second demand. Meghan requested that the camera operator angle the lens 3 inches higher, because she didn't want to appear as though she was looking up at anyone. It was subtle, but symbolic. The height of the camera meant power, control, status. If the lens was above her, she was being diminished. If the lens was level, she was equal. But Meghan didn't want equal. She wanted dominance. She wanted to appear centered, elevated, and untouchable. The camera wasn't equipment to her. It was a weapon that could either protect or betray her. And she wasn't taking any chances. Samira exchanged a quick glance with her assistant. Not a rude one, not an alarmed one, just a professional signal. The kind that says, "You're seeing this too, right?" Because while they had worked with demanding celebrities before, something about Meghan's insistence on microcontrolling every atom in the room felt different. It wasn't entitlement. It was fragility masquerading as authority. A trembling core hidden behind sharp edges. A desperate need to portray strength because the fear underneath was too big to reveal. And then came the demand that turned the room cold. Meghan looked directly at the staff member who was attaching a backup recording device to the table and said, "I need everyone to stop talking unless they're speaking to me." Silence. Complete. Heavy. Immediate. No one moved. No one breathed. No one dared challenge her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even mean. It was sterile. Surgical. A directive issued by someone who believed that her presence entitled her to total control over human behavior. And that's the moment Samira realized this interview wasn't just curated, it was choreographed. Meghan wasn't trying to be understood. She was trying to be obeyed. But the strangest part? She didn't seem aware of how bizarre her requests were. She said them with the confidence of someone convinced that this level of control was normal. Expected. Earned. And when she saw the staff hesitate for even a moment, she added, "It's important for energy. It affects my delivery." As if human existence itself needed to be adjusted to match her internal script. But the most shocking demand was still coming. Meghan shifted slightly in her chair, straightened her spine, and said to Samira in a low, authoritative tone, "Before we begin, I need you to announce me again, on record this time." Samira blinked. The staff froze. No one knew how to respond. Meghan continued, "Calm, serious, intentional. I want the official introduction included. It sets the tone." Sets the tone for who? There was no audience. No live broadcast. No crowd listening. But in Meghan's mind, there was always an audience, even when the room was empty. She needed the announcement the way an actor needs the director's cue. It wasn't about Samira. It wasn't about Harper's Bazaar. It was about Meghan feeding the narrative of her own importance. She wanted to be introduced like a woman of power, grace, and reverence, because she could feel her public influence slipping. This wasn't about ego. It was about preservation. Samira, professional as always, complied softly. She gave a short, polite introduction. Nothing dramatic. Nothing royal. Just a respectful greeting to mark the beginning of the conversation. But for Meghan, it wasn't enough. Her face tightened. Her lips thinned. Something in her eyes darkened for half a second before she forced a smile and said, "Let's begin." Samira couldn't shake it. That moment. That demand. That cold flash of irritation when she didn't get the entrance she wanted. It wasn't the behavior of someone confident and grounded. It was the behavior of someone unraveling beneath a carefully engineered exterior. Someone fighting to maintain the illusion of control so desperately that even the smallest deviation felt like a threat. But the real story wasn't what Meghan asked for. It was what she didn't want anyone to see. Because beneath all the posturing, the micro-demands, the insistence on dominance, there was fear. Deep, raw fear. The kind that makes people overcompensate. The kind that turns insecurities into rituals. The kind that turns interviews into interrogations. And Samira felt it growing with every passing second. The tension, the pressure, the sense that the room was slowly becoming a pressure cooker, and sooner or later, something inside Meghan was going to explode. And that explosion? It was coming faster than anyone realized. Because the demand she made next wouldn't just reveal her need for control. It would reveal something far more telling. Something that made Samira lean forward. Something that made the staff exchange looks. Something that exposed the truth Meghan could no longer hide. And what Meghan asked for next? That was the moment everyone realized the performance was about to break. What kind of person insists on being announced twice before sitting down for a one-on-one interview? What kind of internal storm pushes someone to demand a grand entrance in a room with no audience? No cameras rolling yet. No red carpet. No royal protocol. Just an editor-in-chief, a recorder, and a few nervous staff members. That is the question that launches Chapter 4, because the moment Meghan Markle requested a formal announcement, Samira Nasser knew she was no longer conducting a standard celebrity interview. She was witnessing a psychological ritual, a moment of manufactured royalty, a reenactment of power Meghan no longer held in reality but desperately needed to recreate in micro-sized, artificial environments. And Samira could feel it. The temperature shift, the tension swell, the uncomfortable silence of a room full of adults who suddenly felt like cast members in a play they had never auditioned for. But this wasn't just about ego. This was something deeper. Something rooted in identity, longing, image, and the silent panic of someone whose public influence had been slipping for months. Because if Meghan had walked into the room confident, calm, grounded, and comfortable with who she was, none of this would have happened. Confident people don't choreograph introductions. Grounded people don't need ceremonial validation. Secure people don't require symbolic reenactments of hierarchy. No, this was the behavior of someone fighting ghosts. And Samira could see that immediately. When Meghan made the demand, "I need you to announce me again, properly," her voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't tremble. She didn't appear embarrassed or self-aware. She said it with complete seriousness, as if it were a natural request. As if she were accustomed to being introduced before speaking. As if, in her mind, she still was royalty walking into a room full of courtiers awaiting her arrival. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't playful. It wasn't ironic. It was ritual, and rituals exist to soothe something. Fear, insecurity, anxiety, self-image. So Samira, understanding the precarious energy in the room, decided to comply. But she did it gently, professionally, without giving Meghan the royal grandeur she clearly wanted. She recited a simple introduction. "This is Meghan Markle, joining us for a conversation with Harper's Bazaar." It was respectful, yes, but neutral, minimal, honest. And that's where the shift happened. Because Meghan's face, just for a split second, showed everything. Disappointment, irritation, insult, a tiny twitch near her jawline, a flash of annoyance in her eyes, a slight widening of her nostrils. The micro-expressions trained observers can catch in an instant. The kind of involuntary reaction a person gives when they feel they deserve more. More reverence, more framing, more ceremony, more elevation. Samira saw it. Every staff member saw it. And Meghan saw them seeing it. Which made the air even heavier. But here's where things turned from uncomfortable to revealing. The moment Meghan realized the introduction wasn't going to be rewritten into a royal proclamation, she did something unexpected. She straightened herself, lifted her chin, and said with unsettling calmness, "Let's just remember who I am speaking as today. Not who I am speaking to. Not who I am speaking with. Who I am speaking as." The room froze. Again. Because that sentence told Samira everything she needed to know. Meghan wasn't showing up as Meghan. She was showing up as a character. A persona. a carefully curated version of herself she needed the world to believe in. And when a person begins seeing themselves more as a brand than a human, their behavior stops making emotional sense and starts making strategic sense. And that's when Samira realized something important. Meghan wasn't trying to impress Harper's Bazaar. She was trying to reaffirm her own narrative to herself. She needed to feel like a duchess again. She needed someone to treat her like royalty. She needed to be announced because being announced once meant she mattered. It was a ritual of identity reinforcement. And rituals only exist where identity feels shaky. Samira shifted in her seat, trying to act as though none of this was unusual, but her mind was racing. Because everything about Meghan in that moment felt like a woman trying to rebuild power through theatrics. It was as if the more her real-world influence shrank, the more elaborate her psychological pageantry became. Then came the next bizarre twist, one that made Samira write privately later. This was the moment I realized she wasn't just performing. She was hiding something. Meghan reached for the water bottle placed beside her. But she didn't drink it. She examined it. She turned it. She held it up to the light. And then, with the tone of someone pointing out a major breach in international protocol, she said, "This brand doesn't photograph well with what I'm wearing." Samira blinked slowly. She could hardly believe her ears. Meghan continued, placing the bottle down as though it had offended her. "You know, reflections matter. Labels matter. These things create associations." She said it calmly, intelligently, but with an intensity that felt disproportionate to water. Then she leaned back and crossed her legs, finally making eye contact with Samira. Direct, unblinking, almost rehearsed. "I have a specific image that needs to be presented today," Meghan said. "I don't want anything distracting from that." There it was. The truth, spoken plainly. Not, "I want this interview to be accurate." Not, "I want to share my story." Not, "I want to be understood." I have a specific image that needs to be presented. Image. Not truth. Not clarity. Not authenticity. Image. And as those words settled into the room, Samira felt the weight of them. Because interviewing someone who wants to communicate is one thing. Interviewing someone who wants to control perception is another. And Meghan didn't want a conversation. She wanted a broadcasted fantasy. But here's where the tension cracked further. As Meghan prepared herself, tilting her head, checking her posture, touching her hair at rehearsed intervals, the staff noticed something. Something subtle, but alarming. Meghan wasn't just positioning herself for the camera. She was mimicking movements she had clearly practiced in a mirror. The same three expressions repeated every few minutes. The same emotional beats placed in predictable intervals. The same empathy face. The same vulnerability face. The same nostalgia face. It was all there. Scripted. Executed. Rehearsed. And Samira realized something she would later confide off record. She wasn't speaking to me. She was performing for an audience that wasn't even there. That's when it became clear Meghan wasn't trying to connect. She was trying to survive. She was trying to reaffirm a version of herself under threat. She was trying to control every molecule of the room because any loss of control felt like a threat to her identity. But Meghan's need for micromanagement wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what she tried to keep hidden and what she couldn't. Because just when Samira thought she'd seen all the strange demands Meghan could possibly make, the real one arrived. The one that froze the entire staff. The one that made Samira sit forward. The one that exposed Meghan's greatest fear. And it was about to change everything. What happens when a person becomes so terrified of being seen incorrectly that they begin controlling not only their words, not only their posture, not only the lighting, but even the way other people in the room are allowed to exist? That is the tension that opens Chapter 5, because by this point in the Harper's Bazaar interview, Meghan Markle wasn't simply managing her environment. She was policing it. Every movement, every breath, every angle, every inch of space. And Samira Nasser, watching all of this unfold with the calm eyes of a veteran editor, felt something unmistakable. The atmosphere wasn't just tense. It was unnatural, unhealthy, on the brink of something explosive. The staff felt it too. They walked around Meghan the way one walks around a sleeping lion. Careful, cautious, avoiding sudden gestures, minimizing sound. It was bizarre. And yet Meghan seemed entirely unfazed by the discomfort she was creating around her. In fact, she seemed to draw energy from it. As if holding the room in a vice grip reassured her that she remained in control. As if silence and fear were signs of respect. As if obedience equaled stability. But the reality was much darker. Meghan was spiraling internally, clinging to hyper-control because something inside her was coming undone. The next few minutes made that painfully clear. Meghan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the camera operator, and said, "You're a little too far to the right. Shift left so the angle complements my jawline." Her voice was steady, calm, almost hypnotically precise. No irritation, no impatience, just command. But Samira observed something that Meghan didn't realize she was revealing. This wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about vanity. It was about fear. Fear of being misrepresented. Fear of being captured in a frame she couldn't control. Fear that the unfiltered version of Meghan, the one hidden beneath the perfect posture and curated expressions, would leak out. And then Meghan did something that made Samira's pen freeze halfway across the page. She said, "Make sure my eyes are angled slightly downward. It conveys vulnerability." Conveys. Vulnerability. Two words that should never appear together authentically, because true vulnerability is felt, not engineered. True emotion comes naturally. It doesn't need choreography. It doesn't need stage direction. But Meghan wasn't aiming for emotional honesty. She was aiming for emotional impact. She didn't want to be vulnerable. She wanted to look vulnerable. And that realization hit Samira with a jolt. Meghan was trying to orchestrate sympathy. She wasn't hoping to be understood. She was hoping to be pitied. And that's when the contradictions began piling up so fast that even the staff, trained, quiet, invisible, couldn't maintain their composure. Meghan would say, "I'm all about authenticity," while simultaneously adjusting her chin angle in the reflection of a camera lens. She would say, "I'm in a peaceful chapter of my life," while her shoulders remained locked like someone bracing for disaster. She would say, "I'm happier than ever," while her breathing betrayed the opposite, sharp, shallow, clipped. Meghan talked about transparency, while manipulating every possible variable to ensure no one saw anything real. So Samira tested something. She asked a simple question, a soft one, a harmless one designed to ease Meghan's tension. "What made you choose Harper's Bazaar for this interview? I imagine you had many options." Meghan smiled. The same practiced smile she had been rotating all afternoon. And then she began speaking in perfectly modulated tones about alignment, shared vision, authentic partnership, and creative synergy. It sounded beautiful. It sounded polished. It sounded like a brand pitch rehearsed in front of a mirror. But Samira wasn't listening to the words. She was listening to the distance, the emptiness between the words. Meghan wasn't answering the question. She was delivering a speech, a presentation, a monologue. That's when Samira realized Meghan was not speaking to her at all. She was speaking to the version of the audience she imagines judging her in their living rooms. The invisible tribunal in Meghan's mind. The one she believes must be convinced that she is still graceful, relevant, powerful, victimized, mistreated, inspiring, misunderstood, all at once. But the pressure of maintaining that facade, of keeping her voice even, her posture perfect, her angles controlled, was starting to crack her composure. Samira could feel it. The staff could feel it. Even Meghan, deep down, could feel it. Then the moment arrived. The moment when Meghan's hyper-control stopped being eccentric and became alarming. Meghan leaned towards Samira, lowered her voice, and said, "If you need to redirect a question, do so with compassion. Some narratives haven't fully formed yet. Some narratives haven't fully formed." It was such a chillingly revealing line that Samira didn't respond right away. Because what Meghan meant was clear. She didn't want to be interviewed. She wanted to be protected, guided, shielded from the possibility of being confronted with a question she hadn't rehearsed for. She wanted the interview to serve her narrative, not reveal her truth. But the deeper meaning was even more significant. Meghan was admitting that she was still building her story, still constructing, still editing, still calibrating her next version of herself. And that kind of confession doesn't come from someone confident in their identity. It comes from someone terrified that without a script, they might say the wrong thing and shatter the image they depend on. Samira wrote down the phrase in her notebook, underlining it twice. But the spiral wasn't done. Because just moments later, Meghan made the most surreal request of the day so far. She looked directly at the junior staffer holding a clipboard, a young woman, maybe 23, clearly overwhelmed, and said, "When I speak about compassion, don't look down. Keep your eyes on me. People can feel disconnection, and I need harmony in the room." Harmony. In the room. Not authenticity. Not honesty. Not comfort. Harmony, as defined by Meghan. That was the moment the staff exchanged glances they couldn't hide anymore. Because Meghan wasn't only controlling optics, she was controlling human behavior. She wanted the emotional energy of the room to match the emotional performance she was giving. She wanted everyone to reinforce her narrative in real time. And that's when Samira understood the full extent of the situation. This wasn't insecurity. This was desperation. And desperation always breaks eventually. And break it did. Because just when Meghan thought she had the room fully under her control, fully aligned with her performance, fully synchronized to her psychological script, something happened that none of them expected. Something small. Something innocent. Something that would mean nothing to a stable, grounded person. A whisper. A quiet, almost inaudible whisper. A comment that Meghan wasn't supposed to hear. But she did. And that whisper would ignite the meltdown that changed everything. What happens when a person who is already operating at maximum tension hears something that threatens the very illusion they've spent hours trying to maintain? What happens when the fragile performance Meghan Markle had been guarding with iron fists comes into contact with an unfiltered, unintended piece of honesty? That is where Chapter 6 begins, with a whisper so small, so accidental, so harmless on its own, and yet so perfectly timed that it detonated everything Meghan had been holding inside. It happened right after Samira asked a gentle, seemingly harmless question about Meghan's new jam venture. A question that should have been soft, even flattering. Something like, "What inspired you to start making jam?" Innocent, light, designed to humanize her. And for most people, that would be the easiest part of the interview, a casual question about a quaint hobby. But for Meghan, even this question carried weight, not because of the jam itself, but because the jam had become a symbol, a PR symbol, a rebranding device, a crafted, polished way to sell relatability after years of accusations that she was anything but relatable. Meghan inhaled slowly before answering, her eyes softening as she prepared to deliver another scripted emotional beat. She began speaking about connection to the land, about slow living, about finding courage in simplicity. Words that sounded poetic, too poetic, the sort of lines that belong on the back of a boutique candle, not in a personal conversation. But while Meghan tried to weave her story, while her voice dipped into that slightly trembling tone meant to project vulnerability, something else was happening in the room. The staff were tired, nervous, and, most of all, human. And humans whisper. One staffer, a young assistant who had spent the morning adjusting lights, repositioning tripods, and trying her best to remain invisible, leaned toward a colleague and muttered the fatal sentence under her breath. "She's overacting again." It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be heard. It wasn't cruel. It was exhausted honesty from someone who had spent hours watching Meghan rehearse facial expressions the way a stage actor rehearses dramatic monologues. But Meghan heard it. Every single word. The transformation was immediate. Her voice froze mid-sentence. Her smile faded like someone had pulled a power cord from beneath her skin. Her hands, still poised elegantly on her lap, twitched just slightly, but enough to betray the explosion firing internally. And her eyes snapped sharply to the exact spot the whisper came from. Predator fast, predator focused, like a blade turning toward the source of a threat. Samira noticed instantly. She felt the temperature drop. She felt the shift in the room's oxygen. She felt the eruption building behind Meghan's perfect posture. She tried to jump in, to redirect the conversation, to soften the moment, a trained instinct. But Meghan wasn't listening. Not to Samira, not to the question, not to anything except the whisper that had punctured the illusion she had spent the entire day constructing. Meghan slowly lowered her hands to the armrests of the chair, grounding herself. Her chin tilted, not high, not low, but in that precise angle that she uses when she is preparing to confront someone but wants to appear composed doing it. And she turned toward the staffer. "I'm overacting." Her voice was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that is more dangerous than shouting. The room froze. No one moved. Samira's pen hovered above her notebook, suspended in midair. The assistant's face drained of color. She stuttered, panicked, mortified, whispering, I didn't mean, I wasn't. I just. But Meghan raised a hand. Not aggressively, not violently, but with a calmness that made the gesture even more intimidating. Stop, Meghan said softly. Please, just stop. The assistant obeyed. Too scared to breathe. Too scared to look at Meghan directly. Meghan turned back to Samira, but her expression had changed. The carefully curated softness was gone. Her composure was cracking. The vulnerability face she had practiced earlier was nowhere to be found. Something real was showing now. Something raw, unprotected, defensive, almost wounded. Samira saw it and understood something crucial. This wasn't anger. This was fear. Deep, humiliating fear. The fear of being seen as a fraud. The fear of being caught performing. The fear of someone piercing the narrative she had spent the last hour desperately trying to keep intact. Meghan tried to recover, tried to smile through it, tried to continue answering the question as if nothing had happened. But her words faltered. Her voice trembled. Her breath became uneven. The performance had been broken, and there was no script for what came next. She tried again. My jam is about courage, she said, forcing the words out. Courage. It was almost ironic, because she didn't look courageous anymore. She looked exposed, and exposure was the one thing Meghan Markle could not handle without unraveling. Samira leaned forward slightly, trying to help, trying to offer a lifeline back into the conversation. It's all right, she said gently. Take your time. But Meghan shook her head. No, she whispered. It's not all right. And then, to everyone's shock, she placed both hands on her forehead and closed her eyes, exhaling in a shaky, unstable breath. Something was cracking inside her. Something she had been holding together with sheer force of will all morning. The staff stood frozen. No one dared to move. Samira waited. And then Meghan dropped her hands and looked directly at her with an expression that was equal parts rage, despair, and something else. Something Samira would later describe as controlled panic. Do you know what it's like, Meghan said, to have everything you say, everything you do, everything you feel, analyzed, twisted, thrown back at you? The room was silent. Meghan continued, her voice getting tighter. I can't be human anymore. If I'm emotional, I'm manipulative. If I'm calm, I'm cold. If I'm real, I'm dramatic. I can't win. Samira didn't speak. Not because she didn't have answers, but because she knew Meghan wasn't talking to her, or the staff, or the recorder. She was talking to the invisible audience in her mind. The tribunal, the critics, the imagined millions judging her every second. And that's when the truth became undeniable. Meghan wasn't breaking because of a whisper. She was breaking because the whisper confirmed her deepest fear, that even in a perfectly controlled environment, her performance wasn't convincing. She wasn't believable. Not to the media, not to the public, not to her own team, and worst of all, not to herself. But the meltdown triggered by the whisper wasn't the final shock. Because in trying to defend herself, in trying to explain the pressure she was under, Meghan said something she did not intend to reveal. Something Samira picked up on immediately. Something that explained everything. And that accidental confession was coming next. What happens when someone tries so hard to control the truth that they accidentally reveal it? What happens when a person who has spent an entire morning performing perfection in front of cameras suddenly says one sentence, one unguarded, unplanned sentence, that exposes everything they were trying to hide? That is where Chapter 7 begins, because Meghan Markle's accidental confession wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screamed in a tantrum or shouted in anger. It slipped out quietly, like a secret that had been waiting for the right crack in her armor to escape. And when it did, Samira Nasser knew instantly that this was the moment that would define the entire interview, and later, the entire leak. But before we get to the confession itself, we need to sit in the tension of the aftermath of the whisper. The room had already devolved into a state of absolute stillness, the kind that only exists when everyone is afraid to breathe wrong. Meghan sat frozen in her chair, the remnants of her attempted vulnerability speech dissolving into the air. The staff stood like statues. Samira waited, watching Meghan's breathing, watching her eyes twitch with fragmented emotion, watching the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders like a lead blanket. Meghan tried to regain her composure. She forced her spine straight. She pressed her palms together in her lap. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear like someone trying to find a familiar gesture to tether themselves to. But the truth is, once a person's mask cracks, they can't simply glue it back together in silence. Something always leaks through. And Meghan, who had fought so desperately to maintain an image of serene elegance, couldn't hold it anymore. She looked at Samira with a desperate fragility that she hadn't shown before. "You don't understand," she whispered, as if speaking to someone on the edge of her own consciousness. "I have to be perfect." Samira didn't respond. Not out of coldness. Out of caution. She knew anything she said would either calm Meghan or shatter her further. But Meghan continued anyway, each sentence pulling her further away from the polished version of herself she'd tried to present. "People expect things from me," she said. "Things I can't always give. They expect a narrative." A narrative. That word again. And then, breaking her own controlled cadence, Meghan blurted out something she had not rehearsed. Something unplanned. Something raw. "I can't let them see the real version of this interview." And in that instant, that half-second of unfiltered honesty, the entire room shifted. Because what did she mean by the real version? The version with her genuine reactions? The version with mistakes? The version with emotion? The version with imperfection? Or the version where she wasn't playing a character? Samira didn't know yet, but she leaned forward, instinctively, sensing that the truth Meghan had been hiding was about to slip through the cracks again. Before she could ask a single question, Meghan added quickly, almost in a panic, "Not like this. Not like this." Those 3 words told Samira everything she needed to know. Meghan wasn't simply worried about being portrayed unfairly. She was worried about being portrayed accurately. Because accuracy would expose something. Something she was terrified the world would see. And that fear, that deep, bone-level terror, was pushing her into a meltdown she could no longer disguise. Her breathing grew uneven again. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. She blinked too fast, then too slowly, like someone trying to regulate their emotions through physical movements. Samira could tell the walls were closing in for Meghan. The illusion was laughing at her from the edges, threatening to collapse entirely. Then Meghan spoke again, quieter this time, but clearer. This was the confession, the accidental truth, the line Samira would later write down and circle twice in her private journal. "They don't want the real me. They want the version I created." Samira's breath caught. There it was, the truth behind the entire performance. Meghan had admitted, voluntarily, unintentionally, that she was not presenting herself, but a version she had built. A construct, a persona, a curated identity. And this confession wasn't just self-aware. It was self-damning. Because if she had built a version of herself for the world, what did that say about everything the public had been consuming from her for years? But Meghan wasn't done. "People don't want to see me upset," she said. "They don't want to see me unsure. They don't want to see me vulnerable unless it's the kind of vulnerability that looks polished." Polished vulnerability. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. And Samira understood now. The vulnerability Meghan had been trying to project throughout the interview wasn't vulnerability at all. It was performance. A costume. A mask of emotion designed to look authentic but perfectly safe. The staff, still frozen, exchanged subtle glances. They knew it too. They had watched her practice those expressions all morning. Then, as if suddenly realizing how much she had revealed, Meghan clamped her mouth shut. She blinked hard. She straightened her posture. She tried to return to performance mode. But once someone exposes their truth, really exposes it, there is no seamless return. She sat up, forced a soft smile, and said quietly, "Let's continue." But Samira didn't lift her pen to ask the next question. Because she had seen something that changed the entire tone of the interview. Something that made her realize she was no longer just documenting a conversation. She was witnessing a woman struggling against her own collapsing narrative. Meghan must have sensed Samira's hesitation, because her expression hardened slightly. "Please," she said with a faint edge, "ask the next question." But Samira didn't. Instead, she asked something else, something she hadn't planned to ask, but now needed to. "Meghan, who is the real you?" Silence. A long, heavy, unbearable silence. And then, right when Samira expected either a polished answer or an emotional breakdown, something stranger happened. Meghan laughed. Not a natural laugh. Not a light laugh. A short, sharp laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The real me, she echoed. The real me depends on what people need me to be. And now Samira knew, truly knew, that everything happening in that interview was part of a bigger, more fractured identity crisis. Meghan wasn't living as herself. She was living as her brand. And the brand was slipping. But the whisper wasn't the only trigger. Because after that confession, Meghan did something none of them expected. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled deeply, and for a few